making a prototype is always about asking a question. If you're making a prototype and you don't know what question that prototype is asking, then it's not a great prototype.
Haven't you been involved in, taking prototypes to, I guess, customer, client, consumers, for what you'd call focus group testing or initial product feedback? And can you give some examples of how that's gone?
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the big things that comes up in that is there's different types of prototypes. There's like looks like and like feels like prototypes. There's sort of functions like prototypes, and there's different fidelities that all those prototypes by and large can exist at. And so I've done prototyping at really low fidelities, at really high fidelities, and there's really just different types of feedback and different reasons to do one or the other. But those are always really interesting because those are really important sessions where typically you do scenario driven testing, if you're trying to get something very targeted, or you can have a more open-ended conversation and sort of treat the prototype as an artifact to have a conversation around the same way you would do during like an ethnographic interview.
Mm. So can you give an example of one, maybe from On Point, I guess, which was, a company that you worked in with a couple of others a few years back?
Oh yeah, On Point Design.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there was definitely quite a few projects that we worked on there. Those were often like freelance projects. It was a friend of mine. We sort of started this agency together and collaborated on different freelance projects that we found. I definitely think that was at the beginning of my design career, certainly, and I think a lot of the processes and ways that we went about things were still pretty naive at times. I think testing was definitely something that was neglected, and as a result, I think designs were not nearly as effective as they could have been.
So, I've always sort of wondered, whether, there's a phrase, that a camel is a horse designed by a committee. That when you put the group mind, to something, that it doesn't necessarily get better. And so the idea of, something, an amazing idea jumping out of one person's mind versus, being, I guess, collectively creative. I mean, what's your feeling and thought about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question about design by committee. So I think the designer at the end of the day does exercise some judgment in what things to test first, what avenues to explore. But I think what makes design thinking as like a collaborative process very different than like design by committee is in design by committee you have a bunch of people that are converging together. They're selectively making decisions about what something should be. It might be additive. They might all be just constantly adding multiple things, but those things are all the ideas that are being contributed just instantly go straight to the final product, or all of those decisions immediately inform the final product. And if you're being collaborative in a design process, which is not designed by committee, then everyone is coming up with ideas. Those ideas sort of become part of the process, but they don't become part of the product.
Okay. And so, which have you done more of lately?
Lately, it's definitely been a really collaborative design thinking, certainly at work and at school, but I have seen a fair amount of design by committee. I don't know if design by committee is like maybe not the best word, but I think the client designer relationship that can sometimes happen in agency settings is an interesting example where I think design gets dictated, and it sometimes prevents the solutions from, I guess, reaching their best potential. Like as a designer, when someone says that they want something a certain way, it's not your job to reject or accept it. It's your job to investigate it. And I think, in agency settings, there's sometimes a power dynamic which prevents that conversation from being as successful.
Right. I know when you were at the agency you worked with on the West Coast, you encountered quite a bit of that, perhaps
Hmm.
with basically client, interface and exchange. Yeah, I know that's it's a frustrating, circumstance. I mean, I guess a lot of designers, and we certainly know many designers. Your mom is an amazing designer, and in a creative director. Um, a lot of people who focus on that kind of design thinking would rather actually, in many ways, not have it be a collective kind of circumstance. Um, and so I guess it's probably hard. So how do you draw the line between what's useful, what's helpful, what's valuable, and we should just stop meeting this way?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, design historically was very much like a solo enterprise. There was this
Mm,
designer, and you asked them for something, and they would give you the final result, and it was their creation. And
right,
they, just because they made it, it was supposed to be good. And
right.
I think that this idea that yeah, I think that's a very prescriptive approach. It's this
Mhm.
idea that there are certain people that can prescribe the right thing for people. And I think design thinking is a much more descriptive approach where you look at the world, you try to understand what is happening in it, and you make sure that whatever is being produced by the designer like really meshes with the world that it's being designed into, and that's validated through experiments. Um, and I think that that practice can certainly be done by an individual, but because there's like a more feedback loop between the product and the world that the product is fitting into, it lends itself to just a better collaborative exercise.
Right. And IDEO is, probably one of the top names that, comes to mind in terms of design in Silicon Valley. There was another company called Frog Design, I believe, and there's
Still
probably
around?
still around. Okay, and there's quite a few others who've, been, attached to a lot of mainstream products that, mankind and certainly early adopters of technology have come to love. Um, but I guess I'm just curious because there's more of a movement these days around lots of other factors than just, is it ergonomic? But is it sustainably produced and sourced? Does it have a great story? How do you weigh what is most valuable? Is it really the client who, projects those values, and then the design team has to follow them? I mean, how does it work?
Yeah, I mean that sounds to me like a question about how do you decide on which needs to address.
Yeah,
Like certainly
yeah, yeah,
sustainability is a need, and certainly the client,
yeah.
the business has
Mm,
monetary needs, the user has needs, um, and that really is, that is to be determined by the team and working on the project as a whole. But I think
mhm,
there has certainly been a shift, especially with really large tech companies having a bunch of
mhm,
externalities. I don't know if you saw like that new documentary on Netflix called
mhm.
The Social Dilemma, but that's really been a thing that has
Yeah.
been talked about for a while, is the effects that these companies have in many ways, certainly like on the election. Like these are externalities that large
Mm,
products have on society as a whole, and that's not a human centered problem. That's
right,
not
right,
that's a humanity one. That's like a
right,
humanity centered problem, which is, some
right,
people have coined that as a way to describe that, but it goes beyond the individual
right,
in considering what needs are being served and addressed.
right, right. I mean, there's certainly, I guess, a lot of difference in the world, I think, and different thinking that's starting to, prioritize around, what is the right way, so to speak, to introduce, new design. Um,
I mean, I have my own thoughts on it
yeah,
are,
what are
that
they?
sort of, I think that really can start to come at the end as a safety check on what solutions are being considered.
Hmm.
So I have this, I found this like cute deck of tarot cards. It's styled like a deck of tarot cards. It's called the Tarot Cards of Tech, that this agency, in Seattle put out.
Hmm.
And the goal of it is that each one of these cards is a question to ask about the product and the solution that you've sort of attached yourself to or found, and are working with. And it's a bunch of questions about like how it affects people at scale. Specifically, what happens is like, what if everyone uses your product every day? Or what would it look like if someone were to maliciously use your platform against others? And it's just sort of like different, thought experiments to examine like what would happen if people use your platform in different ways that you might not expect. And I think that
Right.
that should certainly be part of the design process in tech, where products can scale over and have consequences at that scale dramatically.
Right.